Southampton County, Virginia, August 1831. Between the hours of 2 in the morning and dusk on August 23rd, 55 people were found dead across a 16-mile stretch of farmland. Men, women, children, entire families erased from existence in their own homes. The local newspaper refused to print the full list of names. The county courthouse sealed certain testimonies for 60 years. And when the military finally arrived, they killed more than twice as many people as had died in the original incident, most of them innocent. For over a century, Virginia textbooks would refer to these 48 hours only as the Southampton incident, a vague phrase designed to obscure what actually happened. But the truth was written in blood across the tobacco fields of Tidewater, Virginia, in a series of calculated acts that would force America to confront a question it had been avoiding since its founding. What happens when people who have nothing left to lose decide they'd rather die free than live in chains? Before we continue with the story of Nathaniel Turner and the rebellion that shook the South to its core, I need you to do something for me. If you're watching this from Virginia, North Carolina, or anywhere in the American South, leave a comment telling me what state you're from. This story belongs to your history, whether your ancestors were taught about it or not. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear is a piece of American history that powerful people spent generations trying to bury. And make sure you've got time, because this story doesn't end the way anyone expected it to. The Virginia that Nat Turner was born into on October 2nd, 1800, was a place of profound contradictions. The man who had written "All Men Are Created Equal" just 24 years earlier had owned more than 600 human beings across his lifetime. The state that had given America 4 of its first 5 presidents was also home to one of the largest enslaved populations in the nation, nearly 500,000 people held as property. And Southampton County, where Turner would spend his entire life, embodied these contradictions more than most places. It was neither the brutal rice plantations of South Carolina nor the sprawling tobacco estates of the deeper South. It was something quieter, more insidious, a place where slavery wore a gentler mask but cut just as deep. Southampton County sat in the Tidewater region, where the land was losing its fertility after generations of tobacco cultivation. By the 1820s, the great plantation economy was giving way to smaller farms. White landowners were selling off their surplus slaves to the cotton plantations opening up in Alabama and Mississippi, a practice that tore apart families and sent people they'd known their entire lives into an abyss from which there was no return. The threat of being sold south hung over every enslaved person like a sword suspended by a thread. The county was roughly 60% black, about 7,600 enslaved people and 1,800 free people of color, compared to 6,200 whites. Jerusalem, the county seat, was a small town of barely 700 souls, built around a courthouse and a handful of churches. The landscape was flat and humid, cut through with swamps and dense pine forests. The Nottoway River snaked through the eastern part of the county, and beyond the farmland lay the Great Dismal Swamp, a vast wilderness where runaways sometimes disappeared for months or even years. Nathaniel Turner, who went by Nat, was born on Benjamin Turner's farm. His mother, Nancy, had been brought directly from Africa, and she passed down to her son a hatred of bondage that never dimmed. Nat's father, whose name has been lost to history, escaped when Nat was still young, vanishing into the north and leaving behind only the knowledge that freedom was possible if you were willing to risk everything for it. From childhood, Nat was different. He learned to read and write, an unusual thing for an enslaved child in Virginia. The white Turner family initially encouraged this, perhaps finding it amusing or useful. Nat devoured the Bible, and his intelligence was noted by everyone who knew him. He had a gift for preaching, for moving people with his words. But he also had visions, experiences he understood as divine communications. Once, as a child, he described events that had happened before his birth with such accuracy that the adults around him were unsettled. Some of the enslaved people began calling him the prophet. When Nat was 21, he ran away from his enslaver Samuel Turner, Benjamin's son who had inherited him. For 30 days, he tasted freedom, moving through the woods and swamps, living on his wits. Then something happened that would define the rest of his life. He returned voluntarily. He claimed that the spirit had appeared to him in a vision, telling him that he had directed his wishes to the things of this world rather than the kingdom of heaven, and that he must return to serve his earthly master. The other enslaved people couldn't understand it. Why would anyone who had gotten away come back? But Nat's visions were becoming more frequent, more urgent. In 1825, he saw lights in the sky. In 1828, on May 12th, the Spirit spoke to him clearly. The time was fast approaching when the first should be last, and the last should be first. The biblical language resonated through Nat's entire being. He began to see his purpose not as personal escape, but as liberation, as Moses leading his people out of Egypt. By 1830, Nat had been sold again, this time to a wheelwright named Joseph Travis, who had married Nat's legal owner, Sally Moore. Travis was not considered a particularly cruel man by the standards of the time, which meant only that he didn't whip people unnecessarily and provided adequate food. But adequate food and the absence of routine beatings don't make a cage feel less like a cage. Nat worked in the fields and in Travis's workshop, biding his time, watching for the sign he believed God would send. His family had been torn apart by the economics of slavery. His wife, Cherry, and their 2 children had been sold to Giles Reese, who owned a farm nearby. Nat could sometimes see them, but they belonged to another man. In February 1831, something happened that may have been the final straw. Reese's son used Nat's own son as collateral for a debt. Nat's child, his blood, had become a bargaining chip in a white man's financial troubles. Days later, on February 12, 1831, an annular solar eclipse passed over Southampton County. The sun appeared to have a black disk covering its center with a ring of fire around the edges. To Nat Turner, it looked like a black hand reaching across the face of the sun, the sign he had been waiting for. The time had come. Nat Turner spent the next 6 months in careful preparation. He moved slowly, deliberately, speaking only to men he trusted absolutely. He chose 4. Hark, who some called Hercules for his strength. Henry, who was enslaved on another farm. Nelson, a man known for his steady nerve. And Sam, whose owner lived near the Travis place. These were not impulsive men. They understood that what they were planning would likely end in their deaths, but they had decided that some things were worth dying for. They planned to begin on the 4th of July, 1831, Independence Day. The date itself was an act of defiance, a bitter commentary on the Declaration of Independence's beautiful lie. But Nat fell ill, and the date passed. They waited. They refined their plans. They tried not to think about what failure would mean. On August 13th, another sign appeared. The sun turned a bluish-green color, so strange that even white residents remarked on it in their letters and diaries. Modern historians believe it was likely caused by the volcanic eruption of an island off Sicily, particles in the atmosphere refracting the light in unusual ways. But to Nat Turner, it was divine confirmation. The hour had come. Sunday, August 21st, 1831, was oppressively hot. The kind of heat that made the air itself feel heavy, that pressed down on the tobacco plants until they seemed to wilt in surrender. That afternoon, the conspirators gathered in the woods near Cabin Pond, deep enough in the forest that their meeting wouldn't be noticed. They roasted a pig. 2 new men had been brought in, Jack, who was Hark's brother-in-law, and Will, an enslaved man who had been hired out to Nathaniel Francis. Will was known for his strength and his barely contained rage, the kind of anger that simmered just below the surface in so many enslaved men, but that Will had never quite learned to hide. They talked through the afternoon and into the evening. The plan was simple in outline, but terrifying in execution. They would move from house to house, killing the slave-holding families in their sleep, gathering weapons and recruits as they went. Their ultimate goal was Jerusalem, where they would seize the armory. Once armed, they believed others would join them, that the rebellion would spread beyond Southampton County, perhaps across Virginia, perhaps across the South. They would make their stand in the great dismal swamp if necessary, that vast wilderness where no white militia would dare follow. As midnight approached, they prepared themselves. None of them could have known that they were about to set in motion events that would reverberate through American history for generations. They were simply men who had decided they couldn't live as property any longer. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on Monday, August 22nd, they approached the Travis farmhouse. A ladder was placed against the side of the building, leading to an upper window. Nat climbed up first, slipping through into the dark house. His feet found the floor without a sound. He moved through the shadows to the door and opened it from the inside, letting the others in. The Travis family was asleep. Joseph Travis, his wife Sally Moore Travis, and young Putnam Moore, Sally's son from her first marriage, were in their beds. There was also a baby and Joel Westbrook, an orphaned apprentice who worked for Travis. They had gone to sleep without fear, because why would they? They lived in a place where enslaved people had been kept in submission for 200 years. They had never seen a reason to lock their doors. Nat Turner picked up a hatchet from the workshop. He entered Joseph Travis's bedroom first. He raised the hatchet and brought it down, but his hand trembled, or the angle was wrong, and the blade glanced off Travis's head without killing him. Travis woke with a scream. Will pushed past Nat and swung his axe with no hesitation. Joseph Travis died first, then his wife Sally, then Putnam Moore, then Joel Westbrook. They had started to leave when someone, accounts differ on who, remembered the infant. They went back. What happened next is recorded in the court documents with clinical precision, but the act itself needs no graphic detail. They made sure there would be no witnesses, no survivors who could raise the alarm before dawn. They took Travis's guns, old flintlock muskets and fowling pieces, not military weapons, but enough to arm themselves. They took his horses, and they took his sword, which Nat would carry for the next 48 hours. In the Travis yard, as the first gray light began to show in the eastern sky, Nat Turner used that sword to drill his men in military formations. It was a surreal sight, enslaved men playing at being soldiers, practicing maneuvers they had seen white militias perform. Austin, who had been enslaved at the Travis farm and hadn't been included in the initial conspiracy, joined them there. The group now numbered 8. They moved to Salathiel Francis's place next. Francis was a poor white farmer who owned one enslaved man. They killed Francis while he was still in bed. His enslaved man ran and they shot at him but missed. At each house they made the same grim calculation, speed versus thoroughness, the need to prevent anyone from riding ahead to warn others. At Piety Reese's farm, Nat made a decision that reveals something about his state of mind. His own wife, Cherry, and his children were enslaved there. He had the power in that moment to see them, perhaps to take them with him, but he passed by without stopping. Perhaps he knew that having his family with him would slow them down. Perhaps he wanted to keep them away from what was coming. Perhaps he knew that this was not a rescue mission but a war, and in war, personal concerns have to be set aside. We'll never know his reasoning, but the choice must have cost him something. They killed Piety Reese and her son. They critically wounded the farm's overseer, and they moved on. By mid-morning their numbers had grown. At some farms, enslaved men joined them immediately. At others, people refused, either from fear or from loyalty to their enslavers, or simply from the paralyzing uncertainty of the moment. The rebels understood. They didn't force anyone to join, though their very presence put every enslaved person in the county in danger by association. At Elizabeth Turner's farm, they killed the widow Elizabeth and her neighbor Mrs. Newsom, along with the overseer Hartwell Peebles. The group split here. Hark took 6 men on foot toward Henry Bryant's house, while Nat led 9 mounted men toward Catherine Whitehead's place. The Whitehead farm would be the site of the rebellion's largest casualty count. Catherine Whitehead was a widow. Her household included her elderly mother, her adult son Richard, 4 daughters, and a grandchild. When the rebels arrived, most of the family was still in the house. They didn't have time to run. It was here that Nat Turner personally took a life. One of Whitehead's daughters, Margaret, managed to escape the initial attack and ran for the woods. Nat pursued her. The accounts say he caught her some distance from the house, near a fence. He struck her with a fence rail, then used his sword. It was the only person Nat himself killed during the entire rebellion, a detail he would later confess to attorney Thomas Gray. Why he was willing to plan and lead a rebellion but reluctant to kill with his own hands is another question without an easy answer. Perhaps the divine visions that drove him to rebellion didn't extend to the physical act of taking life. Perhaps he understood his role as leader and strategist rather than executioner. Or perhaps in that moment, he simply had to prove to himself and his men that he wouldn't ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. By noon on Monday, August 22nd, the rebels had killed approximately 45 people across multiple farms. They had grown to about 60 men, some mounted, some on foot, armed with whatever they could gather: axes, clubs, guns, knives, farm implements. They were moving toward Jerusalem, following a route that took them past the largest plantations where they hoped to gather more recruits. But word had gotten ahead of them. A few people had managed to escape and raise the alarm. White families were fleeing to Jerusalem or barricading themselves in their homes. Men were gathering, arming themselves, organizing. The element of surprise was gone. The next few hours would determine whether Nat Turner's rebellion would become a revolution or a massacre. As we continue, I want you to think about what you would have done in that situation. If you were enslaved and you heard that others had risen up, would you have joined them, knowing the almost certain consequences? Would you have hidden, hoping to survive? Drop a comment with your thoughts. Hit that like button if you're as gripped by this story as I am. Because what happens next shows us something about human nature that's both inspiring and terrifying. The afternoon of August 22nd saw everything begin to unravel. About 3 miles from Jerusalem, the rebels encountered their first organized resistance. A small force of armed white men had positioned themselves at James Parker's farm. The two sides exchanged shots. The rebels, despite outnumbering the defenders, were driven back. Most of them had never been in a real fight before, had never faced people shooting back at them. The white defenders, though outnumbered, had the advantage of position and experience with weapons. The rebels retreated in some disorder, regrouping in the woods. Nat Turner tried to hold them together, to rally them for another push toward Jerusalem. They moved to another farm, where they thought they might find more recruits and supplies. But the alarm had spread faster than they could ride. White men were converging from all directions: local militia, volunteers from neighboring counties, even men from North Carolina crossing the border to help suppress what they saw as an existential threat. By evening, when the rebels made camp at Thomas Ridley's plantation, Turner had about 40 men still with him. They were exhausted, hungry, and beginning to understand that their window of opportunity was closing. Some of the men who had joined them in the morning had already slipped away, melting back into the woods, hoping to reach their home farms before anyone noticed they'd been gone. The night was tense. Sentries were posted. Every sound in the darkness could be an approaching militia. Just before dawn, the sentries thought they heard something and went to investigate. They found nothing, but when they returned to camp, their arrival spooked the other rebels. There was a commotion, shouting, confusion in the darkness. Several men fled into the woods. By sunrise on Tuesday, August 23rd, Turner's force had shrunk even further. They made one more attempt, approaching Samuel Blunt's plantation, believing Blunt had abandoned it. But Blunt and 5 other white men had fortified the house, and when the rebels approached, they opened fire from the windows. The rebels scattered. In the chaos, Nat Turner became separated from the others. The rebellion was effectively over. Less than 48 hours after it began, Turner's army had dissolved. Small groups of rebels were being hunted through the woods by increasingly large numbers of armed white men. Some were captured, some were shot. A few managed to hide, lying low in the swamps and forests, hoping to survive until the fury passed. but the fury was just beginning. When word of the rebellion reached the rest of Virginia and the surrounding states, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, nearly 3,000 armed men converged on Southampton County, militia from Virginia and North Carolina, federal troops, volunteers who simply wanted to be part of putting down what they saw as a slave uprising. The number of armed men in Southampton County soon exceeded the entire white population of the area. What followed was a campaign of retribution that shocked even some of the white observers who witnessed it. Armed mobs moved through the county, seeking out anyone they suspected of being involved in the rebellion. They weren't particular about evidence. Black skin was evidence enough. A newspaper editor from Richmond who traveled to Southampton County to report on the events wrote that the white retribution was hardly inferior in barbarity to the atrocities of the rebels. White men, drunk on fear and rage, killed black people, enslaved and free, throughout the county. They mounted some of the heads on poles along the roads as warnings. They committed acts of torture trying to extract information about other conspirators. The exact number of people killed in this wave of violence will never be known. Contemporary accounts mention as many as 120 black people killed by white mobs in the days following the rebellion. Most were innocent of any involvement. Some had actually helped white families hide or escape. It didn't matter. The terror that white Virginians felt, the sudden understanding that the people they enslaved might hate them enough to kill them, manifested as indiscriminate violence. One company of militia from Hartford County, North Carolina, reportedly killed 40 black people in a single day and looted the bodies, taking $23 and a gold watch. Their captain, Solon Borland, condemned these acts, not because they were murder, but because stealing from dead slaves amounted to theft from the white men who owned them. Captured rebels were tried in special courts convened for the rebellion, courts of Oyer and Turner, where judges rather than juries decided guilt. The trials were brief. Between late August and mid-November, dozens of enslaved people were tried. 30 were executed after trial. Several were transported out of Virginia, sold to the Deep South as punishment. The bodies of those executed were sometimes dissected or displayed as warnings, but Nat Turner himself was nowhere to be found. For 10 weeks, while Southampton County was occupied by thousands of armed men and white residents lived in a state of panic, Nat Turner hid in plain sight. He never left Southampton County. He stayed within a few miles of where the rebellion had started, moving between several hiding places he had prepared or discovered. The days immediately following the rebellion's collapse were perhaps the most dangerous. The woods were full of armed men hunting for rebels, and they weren't particular about who they shot. Any black person found away from their assigned place could be executed on the spot. The sound of gunfire echoed through the forests constantly during those first weeks. Sometimes men shooting at shadows, sometimes at actual fugitives, sometimes at people who had nothing to do with the rebellion, but had the misfortune of being in the wrong place. Turner's first hiding place was ingenious in its simplicity. He had found a massive pine tree that had fallen during a storm, its root system pulling up a disk of earth nearly 6 feet across. The space beneath where the roots had been created a natural cave, and Turner had enlarged it, digging deeper into the sandy soil. He lined the space with pine needles and covered the entrance with fence rails he'd taken from a nearby property, then concealed the rails with branches and leaves. Unless you knew exactly where to look, unless you were standing directly on top of it, you would walk right past. He lay in that hole for 6 weeks. Think about that. 6 weeks in a space barely large enough to lie down in the August and September heat of Virginia. The temperature inside must have been stifling. The humidity would have made the air feel like soup. He had no light except what filtered through the gaps in his concealment. He could hear everything happening outside. The search parties, the dogs, the occasional shot fired when someone thought they'd spotted something. At night, when the searches temporarily stopped, he would crawl out just far enough to reach a small spring about 20 yards from his hiding place. He would drink, relieve himself, and retreat back into his hole before dawn. He didn't dare start a fire. He ate what food was left for him by people who knew approximately where he was, enslaved people from nearby farms who risked their own lives to keep him alive. One of these people was a woman whose name has been lost to history. Court documents reference her only as a negress from the vicinity, who was questioned about supplying Turner but never charged, perhaps because the authorities couldn't prove she'd done it knowingly. She would leave cornbread wrapped in cloth near certain trees, or sweet potatoes buried in shallow holes, marked with specific patterns of stones. Turner would find these caches at night and take what he needed, always being careful to disturb the area as little as possible. The psychological toll of those weeks is impossible to imagine. Turner lay in darkness, listening to men hunting him, knowing that dozens of people had been killed because of what he'd started. He knew that innocent people, people who'd had nothing to do with the rebellion, were being executed. He knew his wife had been tortured for information. He knew that every day he remained free, more people might die in retaliation. But he didn't surrender. During this time, the white population of Southampton County existed in a state of sustained terror that bordered on mass hysteria. Families who had lived peacefully for generations suddenly couldn't sleep at night. Men sat up with loaded guns, jumping at every sound. Women refused to be alone in their houses. Children were kept inside. The normal rhythms of agricultural life were disrupted because people were too frightened to work in their fields. Rumors spread wildly. Some people claimed Turner had escaped to the north. Others swore they'd seen him leading a new group of rebels in the Great Dismal Swamp. There were reports, all false, of other uprisings planned in neighboring counties. A woman in Sussex County claimed she'd overheard enslaved people talking about joining Turner. The men she accused were arrested and questioned. 2 were executed based on nothing more than her testimony about a conversation she might have misheard or fabricated. The military occupation of Southampton County was extraordinary. 3,000 armed men in a county of about 15,000 people total. They set up checkpoints on the roads. They searched homes, black and white, looking for weapons or evidence of conspiracy. They interrogated people. The questioning wasn't gentle. Men and women were whipped to extract information. Some were tortured in ways the newspapers of the time declined to describe, saying only that methods were employed that no Christian should contemplate. Governor John Floyd in Richmond received daily reports about the situation. His private correspondence from this period reveals a man deeply shaken by the rebellion's implications. In letters to other governors, he suggested that northern abolitionists must have been involved. The idea that enslaved people could organize such an action on their own was too threatening to accept. He proposed new laws restricting not just the movements of enslaved people, but also the activities of white people who might sympathize with abolition. The fear wasn't limited to Virginia. News of the rebellion spread through the South like wildfire, carried by newspapers, letters, and travelers. In North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, anywhere slavery existed, white communities tightened their control. Slave patrols increased their frequency and brutality. Laws were passed or strengthened. The brief period in the 1820s, when some Southerners had quietly questioned whether slavery was sustainable, came to an abrupt end. After 6 weeks in his initial hiding place, Turner's supplies ran out. The person who had been leaving food for him, perhaps the unnamed woman, perhaps others, could no longer do so safely. The area around his hiding place was being watched too closely. He made a decision. He would emerge at night and try to learn what was happening, to see if the massive search had diminished, to figure out his next move. For the next 2 weeks, Turner became nocturnal. He would leave his hiding place after dark and move through the county like a ghost, staying to the forests and swamps, avoiding roads and houses. He listened at the edges of properties, hearing conversations. He learned that most of the militia had gone home, that the sense of immediate crisis had passed. He learned that his men had been captured or killed. He learned that trials were being held in Jerusalem. On several occasions, he came close to being discovered. Once, while drinking from a stream, he heard dogs approaching and had to climb a tree, pressing himself against the trunk while a search party passed beneath him, their lanterns casting moving shadows through the woods. Another time, he nearly walked into a group of men camped in a clearing, discovering them only when he heard their voices and smelled their fire. He also learned, during these night travels, what the rebellion had cost. He overheard white men talking about the reprisals, about the number of black people killed. He heard them joke about it, describe it casually, as though they were discussing hunting deer rather than executing human beings. Whatever moral justification Turner had constructed for the rebellion, and he clearly believed it was divinely ordained, had to be weighed against the reality of what had followed. During this period, Turner apparently never tried to leave Southampton County. He could have made for the north. With his intelligence, his ability to read, and his knowledge of the countryside, he might have made it. Others had successfully escaped Virginia and reached free states. But Turner stayed. Some historians argue he was waiting for another opportunity, that he still believed the rebellion might reignite if he could gather more followers. Others suggest he felt a responsibility to the people who had followed him, that abandoning them felt like a betrayal, worse than death. In early October, Turner moved to a new hiding place. This one was even more audacious, a cave-like depression beneath another fallen tree, this one on land belonging to a man named Peter Edwards. It was less than a mile from where the rebellion had started. The authorities had already searched this area multiple times. Perhaps Turner figured they wouldn't search it again, or perhaps he simply ran out of options. He dug deeper into this new hiding place, creating a space large enough to sit up in. He gathered provisions, roots, wild plants, anything he could forage at night. He settled in for what he must have known couldn't last forever. Every day he remained hidden was another day alive, but the odds were catching up with him. On the morning of October 30th, 1831, a farmer named Benjamin Phipps was walking his property. Phipps was not part of the active search parties anymore. Most men had returned to their normal work, but everyone in the county remained alert, watchful. Phipps carried a shotgun out of habit now, something he hadn't done before August. Something caught his eye near the edge of his property line. A pattern in the ground that didn't look quite natural. Perhaps it was the way the fence rails were arranged, or the fact that the leaves covering them seemed too deliberately placed. He approached slowly, shotgun raised. As he got closer, he could see that the fence rails concealed something, a hollow space beneath the fallen tree. "Come out," Phipps called. His voice was steady, but his heart must have been pounding. There was a long moment of silence, then movement. The fence rails shifted, and Nat Turner emerged from his hiding place. The accounts of Turner's appearance vary, but they all agree on certain details. He was extremely thin, his clothes were in tatters, his skin was covered in dirt and insect bites. He'd lost perhaps 30 pounds. His eyes were still sharp, still intelligent, but there was an exhaustion in them that went beyond the physical. Phipps later said that Turner didn't seem surprised to be found, almost as though he'd been expecting it. "Are you Nat Turner?" Phipps asked, though he must have known the answer. Turner nodded. He didn't try to run. He didn't resist when Phipps motioned with the gun for him to walk ahead of him. As they made their way toward Phipps's house, Turner allegedly asked only one question: "How many of my men are still alive?" Phipps told him the truth. Most were dead or awaiting execution. Turner said nothing more. News of the capture spread through Southampton County within hours. By afternoon, people were arriving from neighboring farms and towns, wanting to see the man who had terrorized Virginia for 10 weeks. Phipps kept Turner in a locked shed on his property overnight, guarding him personally. The crowd outside grew. Some people wanted to lynch Turner immediately to avoid the formality of a trial. Phipps, whether from a sense of legal propriety or fear of being accused of depriving the state of its prize, held them off. He'd captured Nat Turner. The state would decide what to do with him. The next morning, October 31st, Turner was transported to Jerusalem under heavy guard. The road was lined with people wanting to catch a glimpse of him. Some shouted curses. Some simply stared in silence. Turner was placed in the county jail, in a cell by himself. The jail was a simple brick building, and Turner's cell was probably 8 feet by 10 feet, with a small barred window. Guards were posted outside around the clock. Within days, Thomas Ruffin Gray approached the jailers with a proposal. Gray was a relatively young attorney, not particularly successful, who saw in Nat Turner an opportunity. If he could get Turner to tell his story, to confess the details of the rebellion, Gray could publish it and make money. More than that, he could make his reputation. The jailers, after consulting with local authorities, agreed. Gray was given access to Turner. What followed was one of the most remarkable documents in American history, though historians still debate how much of the Confessions of Nat Turner represents Turner's actual words and how much is Gray's interpretation or invention. Over the course of several days, Gray sat with Turner in his cell asking questions, taking notes. Turner, who had nothing left to lose, answered. Gray's published account describes Turner as calm, articulate, and completely unrepentant. Turner explained his visions in detail. The spirit that had spoken to him, the signs in the sky, the conviction that God had chosen him to lead his people out of bondage. He described the planning of the rebellion, the gathering at Cabin Pond, the decision to begin at the Travis farm. He named the other conspirators, most of whom were already dead or captured, so he wasn't giving the authorities information they didn't have. When Gray asked if Turner regretted his actions, given the number of black people who had been killed in retaliation, Turner's response was chilling in its certainty. He said that he had done what the Spirit commanded him to do, that the deaths were regrettable but necessary, that if he could do it again, he would. He saw the rebellion not as a failure, but as the opening act of something larger, a war that would eventually come whether white Southerners wanted to acknowledge it or not. Gray, in his written commentary surrounding Turner's words, tried to paint Turner as a religious fanatic, a deluded man whose visions were symptoms of mental illness rather than divine inspiration. But Gray couldn't completely obscure the intelligence in Turner's responses, the coherence of his reasoning within his own theological framework. Readers of The Confessions were left with an uncomfortable realization. Nat Turner wasn't insane. He was a rational man who had made a rational calculation that death was preferable to slavery, and that any action taken against slavery, no matter how violent, was justified. The publication of The Confessions was delayed until after Turner's trial, but Gray was already preparing the manuscript, already negotiating with printers. He had Turner sign each page of the confession, authenticating it. Whether Turner fully understood that Gray was going to profit from his words is unclear. Perhaps he simply wanted his story told, wanted people to understand why he'd done what he'd done. Turner's trial was held on November 5, 1831, just 6 days after his capture. It wasn't a trial in any meaningful sense. The outcome was predetermined. But Virginia law required certain procedures to be followed, even for enslaved people accused of rebellion. Turner was provided with an attorney, James Strange French, who was appointed by the court. French's job was impossible. His client had confessed. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Public sentiment demanded execution. The courtroom was packed. People had traveled from across Virginia to witness the trial. Armed guards stood at every entrance. Turner was brought in wearing chains. The charges were read: conspiring to rebel and making insurrection. In Virginia in 1831, these charges carried only one possible sentence. The prosecution presented its case quickly. Witnesses testified to seeing Turner during the rebellion, to finding bodies at farms he'd visited, to his leadership of the group. The confession that Turner had given to Gray was read into the record. French mounted no real defense. What could he say? That his client had been justified? That would only get French himself arrested. That Turner was insane? Turner's own words contradicted that. French simply stood and said that his client would rely on the mercy of the court. There was no mercy. The judges, there was no jury in these special courts of Oyer and Terminer, deliberated for less than an hour. They returned with the inevitable verdict: guilty. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out on November 11th, 6 days away. Turner showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He'd known what was coming. Perhaps in his mind, he'd accepted death weeks ago, during those long days and nights hiding beneath the fallen trees. Perhaps he'd accepted it in August, when he first raised a hatchet against Joseph Travis. Or perhaps he'd never feared death at all, believing that what came after would be better than what he'd lived through. In the 6 days between his sentencing and execution, Turner was visited by several people. Some were curiosity seekers who'd bribed the guards for a chance to see the notorious rebel. Others were ministers who tried to get him to renounce his visions, to confess that he'd been misled by Satan rather than inspired by God. Turner refused. He maintained until the end that he'd acted according to divine will. On November 11, 1831, at approximately noon, Nat Turner was led from his cell to the gallows that had been erected near the courthouse in Jerusalem. The crowd that gathered to watch his execution numbered in the hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000. They came from all over southeastern Virginia, from North Carolina, even from as far as Richmond. Some came out of anger, wanting to see justice done. Others came out of morbid curiosity. A few, though they didn't dare show it, came to honor a man they saw as a martyr. Turner walked to the gallows without assistance. His chains had been removed for the execution. There was no point in them anymore. He climbed the steps. The executioner was Edward Butts, the deputy sheriff of Southampton County. A minister offered one last chance for Turner to repent. Turner declined. When asked if he had any final words, Turner reportedly said only, "Was not Christ crucified?" The hanging itself was quick. The trapdoor opened, Turner dropped, his neck broke. He died almost instantly. His body was left hanging for an hour, as was customary, to ensure death, and to serve as a warning. Then it was cut down. What happened to Turner's body next is where history shades into horror. According to multiple contemporary accounts, Turner's body was not simply buried. It was dissected, ostensibly for medical study, though this was likely a pretext. His body was flayed, the skin preserved. Pieces of his skeleton were kept as souvenirs. His skull was reportedly passed among various white families in Southampton County and beyond. As late as the 1990s, a family in Virginia claimed to possess it, though DNA testing to confirm its identity has never been conclusive. This desecration of Turner's corpse served a purpose beyond mere vengeance. It was meant to reduce him from a man to an object, to rob him even of dignity in death. But it had the opposite effect in the long run. The more white Virginians tried to erase Nat Turner, to turn him into a cautionary tale or a symbol of black savagery, the more he became a symbol of resistance. You can kill a man, but you can't kill what he represents. Just when we thought we'd seen the full horror of what happened in Southampton County, the aftermath becomes even more chilling. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries from American history. Hit that like button to support content that doesn't shy away from the difficult parts of our past. And make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to explore how Virginia tried to bury this story, and why it terrified the South for decades. The South's response to Nat Turner's rebellion revealed fears that had always lurked beneath the surface of slave society, and the lengths to which the system would go to protect itself. Within weeks of the rebellion, Southern states enacted new laws designed to prevent any similar uprising. Virginia passed legislation making it illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write, the logic being that if Nat Turner could read the Bible and interpret it for himself, then literacy itself was dangerous. The law carried severe penalties. Whites who taught enslaved people to read could be fined and imprisoned. Free black people who did so could be whipped or sold back into slavery. But the legislative response went far deeper than literacy laws. Virginia's General Assembly essentially rewrote the legal framework governing enslaved people's lives, creating what amounted to a police state within a state. Enslaved people could no longer hold religious meetings without a white person present. Not just a white minister, but any white adult who could report suspicious activity. The law specified that any gathering of more than 5 enslaved people for religious purposes without white supervision was illegal and punishable by whipping. This destroyed the independent black church communities that had existed in pockets throughout Virginia. Communities where enslaved people had found not just spiritual solace, but also rare spaces to speak freely, to maintain their own cultural traditions, to be something more than property. The laws also restricted movement in ways that hadn't existed before. Previously, enslaved people with written passes from their owners could travel relatively freely within certain bounds. After Turner, those passes had to specify exact destinations, exact times of departure and return, and the precise purpose of travel. Enslaved people found without proper documentation could be detained, whipped, and returned to their owners, who would then be fined for allowing their property to roam. The slave patrols, which had always existed but operated sporadically, became constant presences on Virginia roads. Poor white men were paid to ride the countryside at night, stopping any black person they encountered, checking papers, using any excuse to inflict violence that reinforced the social order. Perhaps most insidiously, the new laws created incentives for enslaved people to inform on each other. Any enslaved person who reported a conspiracy, real or imagined, would receive their freedom and a financial reward. This provision poisoned the trust that had existed within enslaved communities. How could you confide in anyone when the person you trusted might see you as their ticket to freedom? The architects of these laws understood something fundamental about resistance. It requires solidarity, and solidarity requires trust. Destroy the trust, and you destroy the capacity for organized rebellion. The economic impact of these new restrictions was substantial, but deemed necessary. Enslaved people who had been hired out to work in towns, a common practice that allowed some enslaved people to develop skills and even earn small amounts of money, were suddenly forbidden from such arrangements in many cases. The fear was that urban environments, with their anonymity and mixing of free and enslaved populations, created too many opportunities for conspiracy. Some Virginia towns passed ordinances prohibiting enslaved people from living within town limits, unless they were house servants directly supervised by their owners. This pushed black communities further into isolation, further away from the possibilities of education or economic advancement that urban areas sometimes rarely offered. The crackdown extended to free black people with a ferocity that revealed how tenuous their freedom had always been. In the months after the rebellion, several Virginia counties essentially expelled their free black populations through a combination of official harassment and unofficial terror. Free black property owners suddenly found their land titles challenged in court. Free black craftsmen found themselves unable to obtain licenses to practice their trades. The message was clear: your freedom is provisional, revocable, dependent on white tolerance that can evaporate overnight. Hundreds of free black families left Virginia in the early 1830s, migrating to northern states or to Liberia, the African colony established by the American Colonization Society as a place to send free black people who white Americans didn't want living among them. The law also prohibited enslaved people from gathering for religious services unless a white minister was present. Black preachers, who had been common throughout the South, were suddenly viewed with deep suspicion. The independent black churches that had existed in parts of Virginia were shut down or placed under white supervision. The message was clear: black people couldn't be trusted to interpret scripture for themselves because they might find in it, as Turner had, justification for rebellion. Free black people lost rights they had previously held. They could no longer serve on juries or testify against whites in court. Their freedom itself became precarious. Any free black person could be re-enslaved through the flimsiest legal pretense. Some free black families who had lived in Virginia for generations began leaving the state, recognizing that their status was no longer secure. North Carolina, Maryland, and other slave states passed similar laws. The effect was to make slavery more totalitarian, more complete. Before Turner, there had been some space, narrow and precarious, but real, for enslaved people to develop their own institutions, their own cultural practices. After Turner, that space collapsed. The system tightened its grip. The psychological impact on white Southerners was profound and lasting. The rebellion shattered a fundamental assumption that many slaveholders had held, that their enslaved people knew them personally, even had affection for them, and therefore would never harm them. Joseph Travis, in whose home the rebellion began, was not known as a particularly cruel owner. By the standards of the time, he was considered reasonable. Yet Nat Turner, who had lived and worked alongside Travis, had killed him without hesitation. This deeply unsettled slaveholding families throughout the South. If a good master could be murdered by his slaves, then no one was safe. The paternalistic mythology of slavery, the idea that enslavers and enslaved existed in a relationship of mutual, if unequal, obligation, became harder to sustain. This paranoia manifested in daily life in countless small ways. White women who had previously thought nothing of being alone with enslaved servants suddenly insisted on having other white people present. Knives and other potential weapons were locked away at night. Some families began sleeping with loaded pistols under their pillows. Children were taught to be wary of the enslaved people who raised them, fed them, cared for them. The intimacy that slavery forced between enslaver and enslaved, the fact that enslaved people worked in the most private spaces of white households, handled their food, cared for their children, became a source of constant gnawing anxiety. The rebellion also accelerated trends that were already reshaping Southern slavery. The domestic slave trade, which had been growing since the constitutional prohibition on importing enslaved people from Africa took effect in 1808, exploded after Turner's rebellion. Virginia and other Upper South states, where soil exhaustion was making large-scale agriculture less profitable, became exporters of enslaved people to the expanding cotton plantations of the Deep South. Thousands of enslaved people from Virginia were sold south in the 1830s and 1840s. This served multiple purposes. It was profitable for cash-strapped Virginia planters. It reduced the concentration of enslaved people in areas like Tidewater, Virginia, where they outnumbered whites, and it broke up potential networks of resistance by scattering communities. The terror of being sold south became one of the most powerful tools of control in the Upper South. Enslaved people in Virginia knew that Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana had reputations for brutal conditions, that being sold there often meant never seeing family again, that the work in the cotton fields was harder and the overseers more vicious than anything in Virginia. The threat of sale south hung over every enslaved person, a punishment worse than whipping because it destroyed everything, family, community, any small familiarity or security you'd managed to build. Parents told their children to be obedient, to never give cause for complaint, because the alternative was being sold away. The internal colonization of the Deep South was built partly on the fear that Nat Turner had created. The rebellion killed whatever remained of the gradual emancipation movement in Virginia. In the months after Turner's execution, approximately 2,000 Virginians petitioned their legislature to begin dismantling slavery. These weren't radicals or abolitionists. Many were slaveholders themselves who had come to see slavery as economically inefficient or morally troubling. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, grandson of Thomas Jefferson, introduced a bill calling for gradual emancipation. The debate in the Virginia General Assembly in January 1832 was remarkably open, perhaps the most honest public discussion of slavery that would occur in Virginia until after the Civil War. For several weeks, legislators actually discussed whether slavery was moral, whether it was economically beneficial, whether Virginia would be better off without it. Some argued that slavery degraded white laborers by associating work with bondage. Others pointed out that Virginia's economy was stagnating while northern states that had abolished slavery were prospering. A few even acknowledged the basic injustice of the system. Delegate Thomas Jefferson Randolph argued that gradual emancipation would allow Virginia to transition to free labor while compensating slaveholders for their property loss. The plan proposed that all children born to enslaved mothers after a certain date would be freed upon reaching adulthood, then colonized outside Virginia, sent to Liberia or some other place where white Virginians wouldn't have to live alongside free black people. But the other side argued that abolition would be too expensive, that freed slaves would become a dangerous underclass, that white Virginians would lose their property rights, and underneath all the economic arguments was fear, raw, primal fear that if slavery ended, black people would seek revenge for centuries of oppression. The specter of Nat Turner loomed over every speech. If this is what enslaved people would do while still under the complete control of slavery, what would they do if freed? The opponents of emancipation invoked the Haitian Revolution, where formerly enslaved people had killed thousands of white colonists. They invoked Turner's rebellion itself as proof that black people were inherently violent, conveniently ignoring the vastly greater violence that slavery itself required. The bill failed by a narrow margin, 73 votes against, 58 in favor. 15 votes different, and Virginia might have begun a gradual process of ending slavery in 1832. 15 votes, and the entire trajectory of American history might have changed. But those 15 votes didn't materialize, and with the bill's defeat died the last realistic chance that Virginia would voluntarily end slavery. The debate itself was never repeated. By the late 1830s, it had become dangerous in most of the South to even publicly question whether slavery should continue. The door that had briefly cracked open slammed shut and wouldn't open again until Union armies forced it open 30 years later. Some historians argue that Nat Turner's rebellion made the Civil War inevitable. By demonstrating that enslaved people were neither content nor docile, Turner destroyed the comfortable fiction that many white Southerners had built around slavery, the paternalistic myth that enslaved people were happy, that they were better off than they would be free, that the relationship between enslaver and enslaved was one of mutual benefit. The rebellion forced white Southerners to choose between ending the system and doubling down on it through violence and repression. They chose repression, and that choice set them on a path toward confrontation with the increasingly anti-slavery North. The cultural response in the South was to create an elaborate ideological defense of slavery that went far beyond previous justifications. Before Turner, many Southerners had defended slavery as a necessary evil, unfortunate perhaps, but economically essential and impossible to end safely. After Turner, that rhetoric shifted. Slavery became a positive good, a system that benefited both races, a divinely ordained hierarchy that reflected natural differences between white and black people. Southern ministers produced sermons arguing that the Bible endorsed slavery. Southern scientists produced pseudo-scientific treatises claiming that black people were biologically inferior, less intelligent, more suited to servitude. Southern politicians argued that slavery was the foundation of Southern civilization, of white liberty itself, that only by enslaving black people could white men be truly free and equal to each other. This shift toward aggressive pro-slavery ideology hardened sectional divisions. Northern states, where slavery had been gradually abolished in the decades after the Revolution, increasingly saw the South as backward, barbaric, antithetical to American values of freedom and progress. Abolitionists, who had been a small minority in the North in the 1820s, gained support throughout the 1830s and 1840s. The more shrilly the South defended slavery, the more repugnant Northerners found it. The more Northerners criticized slavery, the more defensive and extreme Southerners became. Turner's rebellion didn't cause this divide, but it accelerated it, deepened it, made compromise progressively more difficult. In Southampton County itself, the memory of the rebellion was a wound that never quite healed. For decades afterward, black residents measured time as before Nat's Fray or after Old Nat's War. The county's black population used the rebellion as a reference point for their own histories, a marker that said, "We were there, we remember, we know what happened." In their private conversations, in their songs and stories, Turner became a complex figure, sometimes hero, sometimes warning, always remembered. White residents tried to forget, or at least to control the narrative. The official version emphasized the massacre of innocent white families, while downplaying or ignoring the retaliatory violence that killed scores of innocent black people. The farms where the rebellion took place returned to agriculture. Trees grew where bodies had fallen. Life went on, as it always does. But the events of those 48 hours in August 1831 had changed something fundamental in American consciousness. The families of the white victims carried their trauma forward. Children who had hidden in closets or fled through swamps while their parents were killed grew up with nightmares. Some left Southampton County entirely, unable to live in places where such horror had occurred. Others stayed but never felt safe again. The Vaughan family, who lost several members in the rebellion, kept their house, but reportedly couldn't bear to live in the rooms where people had died. The psychological scars passed down through generations. Grandchildren heard stories of that August night, absorbed the fear, the anger, the sense of betrayal that their ancestors had felt. Cherry Turner, Nat's wife, faced unimaginable cruelty in the weeks after the rebellion. Authorities wanted her to reveal her husband's hiding places, his plans, anything that might help them understand how the rebellion had been organized. Under the lash, she gave up some papers, possibly Nat's journal entries, though if they existed, they've been lost to history. Whether she actually knew where Nat was hiding, or whether she was tortured simply because she was his wife, we'll never know. She and her children survived, but what became of them after the rebellion is largely unknown. They disappear from the historical record, as so many enslaved people did. Their stories lost because no one with power thought them worth recording. Did Cherry Turner ever speak to her children about their father? Did she tell them he was a hero or a cautionary tale? Did she remarry, live to see emancipation 34 years later, die before freedom came? We don't know, and that absence of knowledge is itself a kind of violence. The erasure of black women's experiences from history. The rebellion's influence extended far beyond Virginia. In the North, abolitionists seized on it as proof that slavery could not be maintained without extraordinary violence and oppression. William Lloyd Garrison, whose anti-slavery newspaper The Liberator had begun publication just months before the rebellion, found himself accused by Southerners of inspiring Turner. Though there's no evidence Turner had ever heard of Garrison or his newspaper. Garrison published excerpts from letters he received from Southerners threatening his life if he ever set foot in their states. He responded by intensifying his attacks on slavery, arguing that the system was inherently violent and could only be maintained through terror. Turner's rebellion gave abolitionists a powerful rhetorical weapon. Look what slavery drives people to do, they argued. Look at the desperation, the violence it creates on both sides. For enslaved people throughout the South, Nat Turner became a controversial and complex figure. Some saw him as a hero, a man who had struck a blow against an evil system. In the secret spaces where enslaved people could speak freely, in the quarters at night, in the fields when no overseers were watching, Turner's name was invoked with reverence. Songs were created about him, though the lyrics were coded oblique, because to openly praise Turner meant death. These songs survived in oral tradition, passed down through generations, modified and adapted but preserving the core memory. A man who refused to accept slavery, who fought back, who proved that resistance was possible even if success wasn't. Others saw Turner as someone whose actions had made their own lives more difficult, had brought down repression on all black people in the South. The new laws restricting movement, prohibiting gatherings, ending education, these affected everyone, not just those who had supported the rebellion. Some enslaved people felt that Turner's rebellion had been premature, that it had sacrificed lives without achieving lasting change. In conversations reconstructed by historians from later testimonies, We hear enslaved people debating whether Turner had been brave or reckless, whether his actions had advanced the cause of freedom or set it back. Both perspectives were valid. Turner had proven that rebellion was possible, but he had also proven how swiftly and brutally it would be crushed. In the years before the Civil War, Turner's name became a kind of code. If enslaved people whispered about Old Nat, whites understood it as a veiled threat. If abolitionists invoked Turner's name, Southerners heard it as incitement to violence. The rebellion had entered the realm of myth, and like all myths, it meant different things to different people. For some, Turner was a monster. For others, a martyr. For still others, a tragic figure whose courage couldn't overcome the structural realities of power. The publication of The Confessions of Nat Turner ensured that Turner's story would not be forgotten, though it also allowed whites to frame the narrative. Thomas Gray's account, with its emphasis on Turner's religious fanaticism, helped white readers dismiss Turner as a madman rather than a revolutionary. But the confession was widely read in the North as well, and Northern readers often drew different conclusions. They saw in Turner's words not madness but desperation, not fanaticism but faith. The same text that Southerners used to justify increased repression became, in Northern hands, evidence of slavery's moral bankruptcy. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in 1838, later wrote about Turner as one of the heroes of the black freedom struggle. Douglass understood something that white Americans preferred to ignore: that Turner's violence, however terrible, paled in comparison to the systematic violence of slavery itself. A system that tore families apart, that worked people to death in fields, that whipped and tortured and raped and murdered with impunity. Such a system had no moral standing to condemn those who rose up against it. Douglass never explicitly endorsed Turner's methods, but he refused to condemn them either, recognizing that enslaved people had the right to resist by any means available. Modern historians continue to debate Nat Turner's legacy. Was he a religious fanatic whose visions led him to commit atrocities? Was he a freedom fighter who used the only means available to him to strike back against oppression? Was he both? Neither. The answer probably depends on where you stand, on what you believe about the morality of violent resistance to systemic violence. What's perhaps most remarkable about Turner is his clarity of purpose. He never wavered, never expressed doubt, never asked for forgiveness. He believed until the moment of his death that he had acted according to divine will, that the rebellion was necessary and justified, that freedom was worth any price. What's not debatable is the factual record. In August 1831, approximately 70 enslaved and free black people rose up in Southampton County, Virginia. They killed at least 55 white people over the course of roughly 48 hours. The rebellion was suppressed through overwhelming force, resulting in the deaths of somewhere between 100 and 200 black people, most of whom were innocent. 30 more were executed after trial. And the man who led the rebellion, Nathaniel Turner, was captured, tried, and hanged 10 weeks after the rebellion ended. The ripples from those 48 hours spread across decades. The Civil War, which would break out 30 years later, had many causes: economic differences between North and South, the question of whether slavery would expand into new territories, the growing moral opposition to slavery in the North. But underneath all those political and economic factors lay a simple truth that Nat Turner had forced the South to confront. Enslaved people desperately wanted their freedom, and if they couldn't gain it peacefully, they would fight for it violently. That knowledge terrified Southern slaveholders, and their fear drove them to increasingly extreme positions until compromise became impossible. Today, Southampton County has a driving tour of sites associated with the rebellion. The state of Virginia has erected historical markers, though it took until the 1990s for the first one to go up. The Rebecca Vaughan House, the last surviving building where people were killed during the rebellion, was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2006. These are small acknowledgements of events that the state once tried to erase from history entirely. But the deeper questions raised by Nat Turner's rebellion remain unresolved. What do we owe to history? How do we remember events that are simultaneously heroic and horrific, depending on your perspective? How do we honor the people who fought against oppression while acknowledging that their methods involved killing women and children? How do we condemn the system of slavery without erasing the complexity of individual choices made within that system? Nat Turner's rebellion doesn't offer easy answers. It offers only the raw fact of itself, a moment when people who had been treated as property decided they were human beings, and they acted on that belief with a terrible, focused determination that shook an entire region to its core. The blood spilled in Southampton County in August 1831, both that of the white families killed in the rebellion and that of the black people killed in its aftermath, is part of the foundation on which modern America was built. We can't wash it away. We can only try to understand it. This story shows us that the history we're taught is often sanitized, simplified, made comfortable for modern audiences. The truth about slavery, about rebellion, about the violence that built America, is far more complex and disturbing. What do you think of this story? Do you believe we're taught the full truth about events like Nat Turner's rebellion? Do you think violent resistance to slavery was justified? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a story that powerful people tried to erase, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who wants to understand American history beyond what they taught us in school. There are dozens more stories like this one, buried, obscured, or deliberately forgotten. Let's bring them into the light together. See you in the next video.